It seems behind closed doors, Ukraine may already have permission to use Western missiles in Russia. Once they get access to these destructive weapons, they already have key targets in mind that will completely change the face of this war. So today, we'll go over what the top missile target that will inflict the most damage on the Russian army is: the Kerch Bridge. Zelensky has been hard at work trying to get permission to use long-range missiles from the West because Ukraine is planning wide-scale attacks on select Russian territories. Currently, the use of these missiles has been very limited as Ukraine is forced to use air-launched Storm Shadow missile from the UK and the ground-launched ATACMs from the US to carry out strikes on military installations and infrastructure inside its Russian-occupied territories. Kiev argues that being able to use the weapons outside of Ukraine will help to weaken Russia's ability to strike within Ukraine, as it will be forced to focus elsewhere. Ukraine sees the ability to use long-range missiles as a game-changer for the war. If Kiev can strike behind enemy lines, it will be able to target air bases, supply depots, and communication centers hundreds of miles over the border. Taking out air bases is important because it will reduce Russia's air superiority and weaken the supply lines they use for daily airstrikes against Ukraine. The Kremlin has been taking out major military installations in Ukraine, and this has increased the urgent need for Ukraine's ability to strike back. Canada's Defense Minister Bill Blair is in support of this and said, "One of the things President Zelensky and his ministers have made very clear to us is that they're suffering significant attacks from airbases and military installations located within Russia." Let us now dive deep into Ukraine's military strategy for the upcoming months. When Kiev finally gets approval to launch its long-range missiles, it is clear what its first target will be. Crimea holds so much political and military significance, it is no surprise that Zelensky wishes to reclaim the territory first. The Ukrainian president has always been clear about the fact that that is the goal, saying, "This war, which began with Russia's occupation of our Crimea with an attempt to seize Donbass, must end precisely there, in the liberated Crimea and the liberated cities of Donbass, with our troops reaching the state border of Ukraine. We have always kept this goal in mind. We do not forget about it." Reporting on developments in Russia and Ukraine has been keeping us busy, but we need your help. Sometimes our videos get swallowed up because of the algorithm and anti-Putin bots, but giving this video a like helps to keep our content up. Let's get straight into the video. Kiev has also made its intentions quite clear with some of the military strikes that Ukraine has carried out on the Kerch Bridge. A pro-Kiev military partisan group commented saying, "The Kerch Bridge is living its final days." Kiev despises the bridge because it symbolizes a significant loss on Ukraine's side and is of great strategic importance for resupply for Russia. The important bridge, also known as the Crimean Bridge, was opened in 2018 by Putin and was intended to be used as a critical supply route for Russia's forces. At the opening ceremony for the bridge, Putin personally drove a truck over the bridge and led a convoy to commemorate its opening. He hailed the successful building of the bridge and stated that it makes Crimea and legendary Sevastopol even stronger, and all of us are even closer to each other. The bridge covers the Kerch Strait and connects the Taman Peninsula, which is Krasnodar Krai, to Crimea. It spans about 11.8 miles and was built as a dual-function bridge with a 4-lane highway and a double-track railway. Construction of the bridge started in 2014, right after the annexation of Crimea, and it cost approximately $7.5 billion to make. The invasion of Crimea began in February 2014 when thousands of extra Russian soldiers were secretly sent to bases in Crimea that were permitted to Russian soldiers. On the 28th of February, soldiers set up checkpoints at Armyansk and Chang'ar, where the two main roads crossed from mainland Ukraine to Crimea. Though there was no bloodshed, the act was considered an act of violence by Ukraine. The final and complete annexation happened on the 2nd of March, when tough-looking soldiers took over the Ukrainian military bases and carried in the latest Russian military weapons while dressed in regular clothes with no national or unit markings. After ignoring international outcry and solidifying his position, Putin went straight into making the region part of Crimea by building the bridge that served as a link. After laying low and not acting on the matter for years, in 2023, Ukraine launched an attack on the Russian bridge over the Kerch Strait. This was one of its first key strategic attacks on an important route linking Russia with Crimea. This incident was the second time that the structure was hit, signaling that Crimea is a prime target for Ukraine. Reports from Russia claim that marine-based drones were used in the attack, which left 2 people dead. The first attack on the bridge happened in October 2022. Although the causes were not known, the Kremlin attributes it to Ukraine. The attack blew up the bridge as a fuel truck exploded, and 2 spans of the road crossing in the direction of Crimea collapsed. A fire also engulfed a train of fuel trucks on another part of the bridge, which collapsed. Russian President Vladimir Putin called the bridge blast a terrorist attack and said that the organizers and executors were Ukrainian special services. Currently, the bridge is in need of urgent repairs and cannot survive any more structural damage. Its delicate condition could be the end for Putin, as Ukraine will definitely be striking the bridge again when it has the artillery it needs. For most of the war from 2022, Putin was using the bridge as a traffic route for Crimea, which has been his launchpad for his invasion of Ukraine. From there, the Kremlin has been launching regular airstrikes and missiles are constantly flying over the Black Sea. The Kerch Bridge is important because of what it means politically and symbolically for Russia and Putin, who has called Crimea Russia's Holy Land. Crimea has helped to drive Russia's occupation in southern Ukraine, and the Kremlin has packed it with land-based missile systems used on Ukrainian cities and towns. From a strategic point, the Kerch Bridge gives Crimea control over the Kerch Strait and connects the Black Sea to the Sea of Azov, which helps Putin to maintain dominance of the seas. The Black Sea is important to Putin because it hosts his sea fleet, which is used in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. The Kremlin has used the bridge as a strategic fortress and has been able to blockade adversaries from entering Crimea. Russia has the best of both worlds, as it also uses the railroad track to carry supplies to forces in Kherson and other hubs in Crimea. The bridge is used to facilitate the deployment of troops, as well as the heavy military presence that is around the bridge communicates who is in charge. This crossover is such a logistical masterpiece because it quickens the movement of equipment and troops, allowing Russia to constantly be firing at Ukraine. With all of these advantages, we need to point out that the bridge is not just important for attacks on the ground. It's also vital because its location is near air defense systems, which helps Russia too. The bridge's proximity to Sevastopol is also of strategic importance. Sevastopol is one of Russia's main ports and naval bases, which gives access to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. While it has numerous military uses, the port is important because it is an integral nexus for trade with North Africa and the Middle East. This means that the Kremlin's protection of Crimea is also, so that they protect an integral part of their goods supply. While protecting their trade networks, Moscow was also able to disrupt trade between Europe and Ukraine. With more control in the region, Putin was able to stop trade with Ukraine and focus on growing his influence. Now, although the Kerch Bridge and Crimea are of strategic importance to Russia, there is a big sentimental element to why Putin continues to hold on to it. But before, as you guys know, YouTube has a habit of restricting my videos. And sometimes it's not even YouTube's fault, it's the brands that run ads on YouTube. They don't want their ads next to controversial videos, so they tell YouTube to restrict controversial videos like mine that cover geopolitics. That means sometimes we have to forgo covering certain news topics because we know YouTube will restrict that video. But often, those controversial topics are important news that you guys ought to know about. That's why we launched Global Recaps, our own geopolitics newsletter. Every day we send an email directly to your inbox covering the world's most important news. And there is no third-party censoring any topic. If it's important, it will be in the email so you guys can know all about it. These are short and simple emails that take 5 minutes to read. News topics covered in the emails are unbiased, uncensored, and completely free. So sign up now using the QR code on the screen or using the link in the description and become more knowledgeable about the world you live in. Crimea is central to his narrative that Ukraine is a part of Russia, which is why it was the first territory to be annexed. Putin has always believed that it was his right to annex Crimea, and he has a desire to bring Russia back to its former imperial glory. He believes he will be honoring all of the greats before him by taking back the Crimean Peninsula and rewriting all the wrongs done to Russia. Putin's patriotic love for Mother Russia runs so deep, he believes that it has the right to rule over East Germany and Central and Eastern Europe. Putin's crazy dream about Crimea is very old and dates back to 1783, when Catherine the Great annexed the territory from the Ottoman Empire. We're going to take a short history detour here to discuss the Russian obsession with something that has been called the Crimean myth. In 1954, the Communist Party redefined the Soviet Union borders, and Crimea was transferred from the jurisdiction of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The region was still under the control of Russia, but technically Ukrainian territory. This still meant that Crimea was under the control of the Kremlin, but technically a part of Ukraine. After the Cold War, when the Soviet Union collapsed, things became official, and the Western territories gave Crimea to Ukraine. This move did not sit well with Russia, which has always believed that Crimea belonged to the Kremlin after it was unfairly given to Ukraine in 1954. Russia also believes this because the majority of people in Crimea are of Russian ethnicity. For Putin, the taking of Crimea has always been a blow to the sense of national pride. Coming all the way from imperial times, the Russian national identity is built on Russian superiority over other nations. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, egos were shattered. This national feeling was proven by independent polls in 2018 that showed that 86% of Russians were in support of the annexation of Crimea. The return to Crimea, therefore, represents a reigniting of Russian identity and glory. In a speech that he gave in 2014, Putin said, "In Crimea, literally everything is permeated with our history and pride. Crimea is a unique fusion of cultures and traditions, and in this way, it is so similar to Russia. Crimea, in the hearts and minds of people, has been and remains an integral part of Russia." Towards the end of his address, he expressed how he truly felt about Crimea going to Ukraine, saying, "In 1991, Crimea was handed over to Ukraine like a sack of potatoes, because Russia was in such a difficult condition that it could not protect its interests." What Putin did in 2014 also benefited his political reputation. The annexation bettered his political position and made him popular with the masses. The annexation was proof that he could return Russia to its former glory, and that is why he had support of the masses at the beginning of his invasion of Ukraine. Now that we understand why Crimea is so precious to Putin, we can discuss why losing Crimea would mean that Putin would lose the war. Ukraine's recapture of the Crimean Peninsula would do more than shift the tide. It would require Putin and the Kremlin to rethink the war completely. Rafat Chubarov, a Crimean Tatar leader, said, "This Ukrainian territory is extremely important for Putin. This is the question of his life, and not only political. Therefore, it is clear that Russia, especially at the stage of inevitable defeat, will stimulate all of its agents and all of its forces in order to keep Crimea for itself." Already, the major disadvantage of the Kerch Bridge is the fact that it is a single point of failure. A lot of vital networks will go up in flames if Ukraine is successful, leaving Putin with no starting point in recovering ground. Once Ukraine is able to take out the Kerch Bridge with long-range missiles, the rest of Crimea will be a walk in the park. Attacks on the bridge also affect Putin's control of Sevastopol, which would mean a halt to economic trade as well. This is not good news considering that Russia is already struggling to push exports into the global market. After Ukraine knocks out the bridge, taking back Crimea will be easier. We can tell from the discussion that we had earlier that without the region, Russia would lose the convenience of easily moving tanks and weapons to the front lines. Ukraine has already begun to deal deadly blows in Crimea, with satellite imagery confirming damage to Russian radar installations, electronic warfare assets, logistics routes, and airfields. Justin Bronk, a senior research fellow for air power and technology at the Royal United Services Institute in London, said, "It is definitely fair to say the Ukrainians have had pretty impressive successes over the past couple of months. Crimea may be the key to end the war, but it could also be the end of Putin's reign. If he loses Crimea, all the promises that he has been making to the Russian people will be unmet, and that would affect his image. As more casualties roll in and soldiers and commanders experience loss after loss, they will be pointing fingers at their once indestructible leader. Currently, the Russian people are also suffering economic strain because of the sanctions and the growing defense budget. Another loss, like that of a region that brought them a sense of pride, will only send them off the rails and destabilize Putin's control. Collectively, Russia's self-image will be destroyed, and this loss could put an end to the belief in the Crimean myth. Such a victory would also be monumental for Zelensky, as it would also prove to the world that Putin is not the scary leader he pretends to be. Ukraine has been working hard to turn the tides, and these new permissions that are about to be given by the West to use long-range missiles will change everything. While Crimea has the most strategic value as a target, we are going to discuss other regions that could get some missile action. The region of Kursk is an important site for Kiev because it is the first region in western Russia that Ukraine invaded. In August, Kiev launched its incursion into Kursk and took over 500 square miles while capturing 100 Russian towns and villages in a short space of time. Kursk's proximity to Moscow makes it a weak spot, as a missile attack in the area would likely impact the capital city too. Logistically, Kursk is a supply hub for the Russian military because it has good rail and road connections within it. Military bases like the 6th Combined Arms Army are a part of the Western Military District, which means that Ukraine could potentially attack the region to take out the troops in that area. On a symbolic level, launching missiles to the Kursk region would be vindication for Kiev, and this would show Russia that it can go toe-to-toe on the battlefield. Moving on, another potential site for the attack could be the Kavkaz port in Krasnodar, Russia. There have been reports of Ukraine using American ammunitions in the region, and although this has not been confirmed, the claims are probably true. The port is strategically placed because it is near the city of Krasnodar on the Sea of Azov. It connects Russia to the Black Sea and allows naval vessels to reach the Mediterranean Sea. Ukraine choosing this as a missile target could cause some real problems for Russia, because this would mean that important naval bases nearby and sea fleets would be wiped out. We should also mention Belgorod, because with all the reports of bombing coming from this southern Russia region, we can see that Ukraine has its eye there. The Ukrainian army has been using artillery and drones to target this site that is near the southern border of Russia. Another reason why it makes a good target is that there are air bases that are situated in the area that have Russian Su-34 and Su-35 fighter jets, which Ukraine would be happy to have out of the skies. Logistically, Belgorod has a highway that connects Moscow to Kharkiv. If Ukraine could take out this area, it could cut off part of Russia's access to the Kharkiv region. Ukraine's strategy could also be to hit the Kremlin's pockets based on recent drone attacks on an oil depot near Polotarsk, Russia. Satellite imagery shows that a fire broke out and large parts of the land were burned out. Ukraine could also decide to hit more oil depots around Russia, and this would have devastating circumstances. With so many good targets to choose from, Ukraine is going to have fun trying to decide which targets make sense. This also means that Putin will be very busy putting out fires in every region of Russia. Strategically, Ukraine's attack on the Kerch Bridge in Crimea is enough to put an end to Putin. So much of Russia's war efforts in Ukraine rest on the operations in Crimea, and the Kremlin has been building its strategy from here. If Ukraine is finally able to reclaim the territory, this means that all of Putin's efforts and strategy from 2014 will be turned into nothing. As we wait to see how the White House responds to Zelensky's negotiations, we can hope that things will start looking up for Ukraine.
If this decision is taken, it will mean nothing less than the direct involvement of NATO countries, the United States and European countries in the war in Ukraine. This will mean that NATO countries, the US and European countries are at war with Russia.
The US has given Ukraine permission to strike inside Russia using American missiles, but there will be no public announcement. At least that's what The Guardian's reporting. On top of that, one Western official quoted PBS News saying, "The first announcement of this policy will land when the first missile lands in Russia." Ever since Ukraine invaded Kerch in August, Moscow has not been able to catch a break. The tide's about to change for the war, as the UK and the US have just granted Ukraine permission to strike with Western weapons in Russia. Negotiations with the White House and Downing Street have been ongoing throughout the year, as Zelensky has been gearing up for more attacks inside Russia. To be able to stay on the offensive and continue gaining ground in Russia, Zelensky needed to be able to launch long-range missiles to strike in Russian territory. UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron led the way when he commented on the Ukrainian war, pledging that it was going to give Ukraine $3.84 billion in military aid to help them win the war against Russia. After making this promise, the secretary went on to make a statement greenlighting Ukraine. David Cameron is quoted as saying, "Just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine, you can quite understand why Ukraine feels the need to make sure it's defending itself." The UK is not the only country that's done this, and the US has also granted permissions to Ukraine, meaning Putin's in for some trouble. In this video, we're going to discuss the situation with the UK and the US, while also talking about all the Ukraine allies coming together to help Ukraine fight against the strongman Putin. The war in Ukraine and Russia is changing every day, and we're working hard to keep you guys posted on everything that's happening. Sometimes it's hard to do this because of Putin's bots that dislike our videos and push our content back. Do us a favor and give this video a quick like so we can keep bringing you all the news as soon as it happens. Let's get right into it. It has taken a long time to get here, but finally the UK and the US are seeing things from Kiev's perspective. With permission from these two countries, Ukraine's going to be in a much stronger position in the conflict as it'll be able to take out essential structures inside Russian territory. Zelensky hopes that with the restrictions lifted, he'll be able to strike Russian airfields, missile launchers, ammunition depots, fuel storage, and command and control centers. Now, the first question is, why did this take so long? For both countries, the fear was that assisting Ukraine too much could lead to an escalation in the war that would require everybody to get involved. Moscow knew this and manipulated the West's fear by regularly talking about crossing a red line. In his annual State of the Union address, Putin made this threat by saying, "We don't want to burn bridges, but if somebody interprets our good intentions as weakness, our reaction will be asymmetrical, rapid, and harsh. We decide for ourselves in each case where the red line is." From the beginning, the White House's aim was to give Kiev support without being dragged into direct conflict with Moscow. The problem that Washington was facing was that there was a split in opinions about whether all restrictions should be lifted. Most US State Departments have been calling for a lift on restrictions, but intelligence agencies and the Pentagon have been advising Biden not to allow the use of long-range weapons in Russia. Another reason the decision took time for the US was because there were certain interests in Russia that the US needed to be protected. In 2024, Ukraine began to launch attacks on Russian oil refineries. Ukraine considers these to be legitimate military targets because they're used to fuel Russia's military. The problem was that the United States was worried about the economic impact of taking out these refineries. As Ukraine's military ally, the US has told them to halt on these attacks. Biden had hoped to keep the oil prices stable, but it seems this is not a problem anymore, allowing Ukraine the opportunity it's been waiting for. Previously, Ukraine had struck two of Lukoil's facilities in early 2024, in Volgorod and Nizhegorod Neftyogzintes. This was strategically important because they provided for 11% of Russia's gasoline requirements. The attacks were a small victory for Ukraine as the factories had contracts to supply the Russian military. What's pushed Britain to give its permission is what's been happening in recent days between Russia and Iran. Speaking at a press conference, British Foreign Secretary David Lammy said Russia was guilty of a significant and dangerous escalation by receiving Iranian ballistic missiles for use in its war in Ukraine. The UK's act of pledging money to Ukraine was already very frustrating for the Kremlin, but the continuous changes in its stance are going to send Putin through the roof. The commitment of $3.84 billion will be renewed every year for as long as it takes to beat Russia. What really delivered the blow was the comment made by the Foreign Secretary, which represents a willingness to change the rules for Ukraine. A spokesperson for Britain's Ministry of Defense said that Ukraine had a clear right of self-defense against Russia's illegal attacks, and that does not preclude operations inside Russia. This means that British tanks, anti-tank missiles, and any other military equipment given to Ukraine can be used inside Russia as part of Ukraine's defense. This is Putin's biggest nightmare, as he believes that the West is trying to use its weapons in Russia to escalate the war. So far, Ukraine has used British drones, heavy artillery, and tanks to capture more than 390 square miles of Russian territory. There are also reports that Ukrainian troops have been using British Challenger 2 tanks inside Russia, but these are all rumors. Now, with Ukraine having permission to strike Russian targets inside Russian territory, we could be inching closer to the end of the war. Prior to this, the UK had been very strict about these restrictions. Since February 2022, the UK had insisted that its weapons could only be used within Ukraine's international borders and could not be deployed inside of Russia. However, as Russia continued on the offensive, the UK began to warm up to Zelensky's requests. In February 2024, a statement was released reading, "We want to be clear that the UK will never recognize Russia's illegal claims to the region or any Ukrainian territory, and that we'll continue to do all we can to stop Putin's war machine and support Ukraine in their fight for as long as it takes." The UK has kept its promise and has now lifted the restrictions on the use of British weaponry. Up until this point, Putin's tricks had been working, and most countries had been taking a step back and limiting the weaponry that they supplied Ukraine with. Moscow had been able to launch operations in Ukraine without the fear of a direct threat being posed. Putin was aware of the fact that Ukraine was receiving weapons from overseas, but he was confident that those weapons were being used to kill Russian troops inside Ukraine only. Now, with everything that's been unfolding, Putin's confidence is shaking. His original plan is no longer working, and countries like the UK are stepping in. This is in part due to Zelensky's negotiation skills. In July, during Ukrainian President Zelensky's visit to Downing Street, he'd worked hard to convince the UK to work with Western allies to remove the limits on the use of weapons, because he believed that increasing Ukraine's long-range capability would force Russia to seek peace. The Kremlin has not taken the UK's actions very well, which is to be expected. Before that, as you guys know, today's geopolitical world moves very fast, and it's pretty much impossible to keep up with all the news. That's why I launched Global Recaps, a geopolitical newsletter that covers world news in a quick and simple way. Every day, I send out an email directly to your inbox that covers the most important world news that you can read in less than 5 minutes. Best of all, it's completely free, and you can sign up now by using the link in the comments or link in my bio. Now, back to the video. Moscow has taken the statements made by the British Secretary as a direct and dangerous escalation of tensions that could exist between the West and Russia. It also made it clear that it would respond if Ukraine launched strikes against Russian territory with British weapons. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov commented on Cameron's comments saying, "This is a direct escalation of tension around the Ukrainian conflict which could potentially pose a danger to the entire European security architecture." Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova added, "This is the first time that a Western politician has so frankly acknowledged what has long been a well-known secret for a majority of the world's countries, that the West is waging a covert war against Russia with the hands of Ukrainians." Speaking directly to Cameron's comments, she responded by saying, "How irresponsible and callous do you have to be not to realize what such statements lead to, especially with regards to countries with nuclear weapons? We always respond, but how can you not think about the feelings of British subjects and EU citizens?" As if these statements weren't enough, Russia summoned the British ambassador Nigel Casey to make a formal complaint against Cameron's comments. According to Britain's sources, Casey was not summoned, and the meeting was actually pre-arranged to discuss the UK's support of Ukraine. Russia used the opportunity to threaten Britain and warn them against using British weapons on Russian soil. On Thursday, Putin issued more warnings against the actions of the UK and the US. He's continuously made it clear that the use of long-range missiles is going to be interpreted as a direct conflict with Russia. His reasoning is that since Ukraine's armies are going to need NATO specialists to program the missiles, that would be their direct involvement in the war.
Дело в том, что я уже об этом говорил, и любые эксперты это подтвердят, и у нас, и на Западе. Наносить удары современными высокоточными системами большой дальности западного производства украинская армия не в состоянии. Она не может этого делать.
While all this support from the UK is exciting, the country that both Ukraine and Russia have been waiting patiently for is America, and now Washington's given its permission to Ukraine as well. In the beginning, the US was very clear that it did not want US-supplied equipment to be used for direct attacks into Russia. Then, in May 2024, President Joe Biden gave Ukraine permission to carry out limited strikes using US weapons in Russian territory around Kharkiv. The policy's been slowly shifting, and in recent months, Washington has moved from a blanket ban to allowing Ukraine to use US-supplied weapons when it comes to defensive strikes. Ukraine's been negotiating with America about the use of its long-range Army tactical missile system to target sites inside Russia, and the negotiations have been successful. At first, Washington was advising Kiev to focus the use of Western weapons on defending the eastern and northern regions of Ukraine, Crimea, and retaining access to the Black Sea. But now, Ukraine will be able to attack Russia. In relation to whether Ukraine can use long-range weapons from America, the US is finally allowing Ukraine to go ahead after months of lengthy discussion. When asked by reporters last week, President Biden had initially said that his administration was working that out now, but now a final decision has been given. The discussions have been successful, and US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and British Foreign Secretary David Lammy traveled to Kiev this week. During a press conference, Blinken said, "One of the purposes of the trip that we'll be taking together is to hear directly from the Ukrainian leadership, including President Vladimir Zelensky, about exactly how the Ukrainians see their needs. In this moment, to what objectives and what we can do to support those needs." As permissions from these two countries have come, Putin's fears increase as reports come in that other countries are slowly warming up to the idea of giving permission too. Let's start with Latvia and Finland, who have made comments that follow the same tone as Cameron's. According to sources in the Defense Ministry, Finland has not set any restrictions on the use of weapons it's supplied to Ukraine. The chair of the Parliamentary Defense Committee, Jukka Kopra, NCP, stated, "According to my information, Finland has not set such restrictions, and Ukraine has the right to use these weapons against military targets also on Russian soil." Jukka Kopra even went as far as saying, if necessary, Ukraine should also strike military targets on the Russian side. It's a completely legitimate defensive battle that Ukraine's waging. The UN Charter allows military targets to be attacked across land borders. Latvia has always been loud about its support of Ukraine, and has even urged other Western allies to get with the program. Latvian President Edgar Rinkevics has encouraged Western allies to lift restrictions on the use of weapons it provides to Ukraine. Rinkevics believes that the success that Russia is experiencing is because Ukraine's been limited by the restrictions on the use of its weapons. As long as the targets are legitimate military targets and not cities or civilians, the Latvian president believes Ukraine should have full reign. Latvia's urgency has a lot to do with the fear that once Ukraine's defeated, it will be next. If the West can band together and stop Russia now, more European countries will be spared from the hands of Putin.
Why is it so fundamental and so important for you? What about your knowledge of the area you're positioning?
About Ukraine, I think that for us it's a matter of security, because we believe that if Ukraine loses, then our security is going to be impacted in a very negative way. I think that has been repeated many times. But also it's about international law, it's about international order, and I think that we don't want to see the repetition of the darkest moments of history, and my country has experienced those.
Latvia also understands that Russia's been using the fear that the West has to its advantage. Rinkevics is quoted saying, "There's probably fear, and I think it's groundless, that Russia could use tactical nuclear weapons. I think this is blackmail by Russia, very well calculated. But some governments are buying in. This is not something that I could advise." To add to the list, NATO's also begun to speak up on the matter in support of Ukraine. In an interview, NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg claimed that the time has come for Ukraine's allies to consider lifting some restrictions on the use of weapons in Russia. After watching everything that Russia's done in the Kharkiv region, NATO's beginning to question whether it should be sitting back and letting Russia continue unchecked. He's quoted from the interview saying, "The time has come to consider whether it would be right to lift some of the restrictions which have been imposed. Because we see now that, especially in the Kharkiv region, the front line and the borderline is more or less the same. If NATO gets on board with the use of military equipment donated by its member nations, Russia's really about to experience some losses on the front line." More allies are coming forward, and Poland's foreign minister, Radoslaw, stated that his country's not ruling out sending its troops into Ukraine. While the conversation around NATO troops being in Russia has been ruled out by most countries, Poland thinks that it should be a possibility. Months earlier, when French President Emmanuel Macron had said something similar, many of the allies shut him down. But Minister Radoslaw thanked him for saying the things that needed to be said. Statements like these being made by NATO member nations have very serious implications. Putin has made it very clear that he will take the use of NATO troops as a sign that direct conflict must take place, and he would not hesitate to use nuclear force. Unfortunately for Putin, the West is tired of hearing these threats, and they might actually just disregard them. In response to the comments by Macron, Putin ordered his military to hold battlefield nuclear weapons drills as a way of showing the West what he was working with. In May, in the southern military district that lies adjacent to Ukraine, Russia ran some exercises for the launch of a tactical nuclear warhead. As a close ally of Russia, Belarus was also involved in the drills. The exercise was to keep soldiers practiced equipping potential launch vehicles with missiles. The Russian Foreign Ministry made it clear that this drill was meant to be a signal to the West that it needed to stay out of its war with Ukraine. A statement by Russian officials stated, "We hope these drills will cool the hot heads in Western capitals while helping the countries that have provided the green light to Ukraine to realize the potential catastrophic consequences of the strategic risks they're generating." Putin has used all of this conversation as an opportunity to show Moscow's power, but it's not certain how much longer this will work. We're going to talk about the United States' controversial position on the matter, but first, let's take a look at what some of Ukraine's allies are saying. In Germany, the government's given Ukraine permission to strike Russian territory with weapons provided by Berlin. According to German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, as long as the targets are not civilians and buildings, Ukraine's allowed to attack. Scholz is quoted saying, "I find it strange when some people argue that Ukraine should not be allowed to defend itself and take measures that are suitable for this." Germany's provided Ukraine with weapon systems like its self-propelled howitzers and Mars 2 rocket launchers, but it's still hesitant to give Ukraine its long-range weapons. Despite negotiations, Germany's declined to give its long-range Taurus cruise missiles because it fears this will bring it into direct confrontation with Russia. Another country that's been by Ukraine's side from the very start is Denmark. In March 2023, the Danish government set up the Danish National Ukraine Fund, which aimed to provide long-term support for Ukraine. So far, approximately $9.06 billion has been placed in the fund to provide military support and training. The money's also expected to help with civilian support for urgent humanitarian efforts and long-term reconstruction in Ukraine. In addition, Denmark also donated long-range Harpoon coastal defense missile systems which Ukraine used in the Black Sea to target Russian fleets. In relation to its comments on whether or not Ukraine can use its weapons in Russia, Denmark has been cryptic, but the message is clear. Denmark states that Ukraine's use of the weapons must be within the bounds of international law. This means that if Ukraine's acting in self-defense to defend its sovereignty, they're free to attack Russia. Finally, the Czech is also behind Ukraine using its weapons within Russia. Since 2023, the Czech has been a big supplier of weapons for Ukraine, donating 89 tanks, 226 fighting and armored infantry vehicles, 38 howitzers, 33 multiple rocket launchers, 6 air defense systems, and 4 helicopters. With such big support for Ukraine, it's no surprise that Czech Prime Minister Petr Fiala believes that Stoltenberg's statement is absolutely logical. He argues, Ukraine is a country defending itself against Russian aggression, and as an attacked country, it certainly has all the rights to use all possibilities for its defense. While Ukraine rejoices in the UK and the US getting on board with their use of weapons in Russia, there are rumors that Kiev has already started using them. In 2024, aerial images showed that Ukraine used an MGM-140 ATACMs on a Russian base in Luhansk. These missiles are capable of reaching a speed of 2,300 miles per hour. They have a range of around 186 miles and they can carry a 500-pound warhead. The missile also releases small bomblets upon detonating, allowing impact on a large area with explosions rather than unleashing a precise missile strike. The strike hit a Russian training ground and killed 116 troops. Another strike destroyed a launcher and charger, which were hit by 6 of these missiles. There have also been reports of attacks in Sevastopol, with a missile strike taking out 2 Russian landing strips and damaging infrastructure. Ukraine was comfortable attacking Sevastopol and Crimea because they're territories that Russia annexed from Kiev, and they're after what's rightfully theirs.
They will hit the Russian economy hard.
Tonight, Russia is feeling the shock of Western sanctions.
Most of those are linked to Russia's aggression in Ukraine. They intensified with Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022.
Russia's burning, and this time I mean economically. In fact, one Russian oligarch, Oleg Deripaska, has now publicly said there will be no money already next year. Russia needs foreign investors. As things continue to get worse on the war front for Russia, with the international sanctions taking their toll, Russian banks are facing heavy challenges of having to deal with the effect of a falling ruble. If things continue to go this way, Russian banks are going to be forced to sell assets at reduced prices to meet demand from depositors wanting their money back. The current discrepancy between foreign currency on hand versus deposits owed is at an unprecedented $46 billion to $280 billion. Worse yet, it seems Russia's faithful ally, China, has ordered its banks to stop doing business with Russian counterparts. On top of just pausing business, Chinese banks are also withholding payments that are owed to Russian businesses. This has poured gasoline on the fire that was the fall of the Russian banks and economy. So in this video, we'll discuss why Russian banks are failing, the economic effects of sanctions, and why Chinese banks have left Russia high and dry in their time of need. If you're ever struggling to find some of our videos, it's because the YouTube algorithm and Putin's bots don't want you to see them. Our content is a bit daring, so we aren't really popular with everybody. To keep us afloat, please give this video a like and help us push our content out. Now, let's get into today's topic. To start, the failing bank system is not good for Russians who store their savings in foreign currency. The Institute of International Finance estimates 21% of Russian deposits are held in foreign currencies, and this means that soon people will be scrambling to get their money out of the banks as the financial sector becomes unstable. In response to the sanctions, the central bank has had to order Russian companies to sell dollars they earned from foreign business transactions to boost the supply of foreign currencies in the banks. From here, there's likely to be a rise in bad loans and an imposition of deposit withdrawal limits. The group that suffers the most from this is Russian businesses, which are going to be working overtime to repay foreign debts as the exchange rate worsens. The first signs that the banking system was crashing came in 2023, when Russia's biggest bank, Sberbank, reported a nearly 80% plunge from 2022. The bank's annual profit came up to 270.5 billion rubles, which is about $3.57 billion. This figure was $396 million lower than what was reported in the previous year. The CEO of the bank, German Gref, called 2023 the most difficult year, and many banks had to limit disclosures and dividend payments to maintain stability. The bank had to implement an anti-crisis plan, with Gref stating, "We implemented an anti-crisis plan. We radically revised our priorities, introduced the strictest savings measures, closed and sold international businesses, and also made the necessary provisions for the loan portfolio and blocked assets." Other lenders like Bank VTB have suffered too, and as commercial banks scramble for profits, Russia's central bank anticipates there will be systematic risks. Banks are now focusing their business prospects and turning to the state for contracts, especially in the area of defense, where most of Russia's money is going. Russian billionaire Oleg Deripaska, who's very outspoken about his feelings towards the war, forecasted that there would be no money in 2024. Speaking at an economic conference in Siberia, he stated, "There will be no money already next year. We need foreign investors." Deripaska has not been afraid to call out Putin on what's happening in Ukraine, as he feels like the spending in Ukraine is sinking Russia's economy. His prediction was right, and the forecast for 2024 is not looking good for banks either. Dmitry Pyanov, who's the CFO for VTB, which is the second largest bank in Russia, said, "There's a clear understanding that banking sector profits in 2024 will be seriously lower than in 2023. This is because consecutive interest rate hikes have seriously damaged Russian banks' prospects, and they're anticipating a drop in the sector's profits." The central bank has mercilessly jacked up interest rates to 13% to try to handle inflationary pressures, labor shortages, and a wide budget deficit. Pianov told reporters, "We have about 15 billion rubles of falling interest income per 1 percentage point increase in the key rate. In this situation, you can calculate what kind of falling income we'll have." Up till this point, Russia's been relying on the yuan, but with reports of a yuan liquidity deficit, they're in trouble. Now, before we get into that, I quickly wanted to answer a question I recently got asked. A lot of you guys want to start a YouTube channel, but you're camera shy or just not comfortable putting your face out there. In fact, I'm one of those people, and that's why this channel has no face on it. Luckily, you can still grow on YouTube even without showing your face or giving up your privacy. This channel's the living proof of that. In fact, here are just a few examples of channels that started in the last 12 months and grew an audience without showing their face. They've gotten millions of views and made thousands of dollars from them. We recently crossed 1 million subscribers, and along the way, we've learned a few tips and tricks about YouTube that can be very helpful to any of you who want to start your channel. We've included all this in my completely free 7-day YouTube Crash Bootcamp. So if you're someone who's interested in starting a YouTube channel, this is the perfect starting point for you. What better way to convince you than to read a comment left by a previous student? This free bootcamp's better than a paid course he took. So if you're interested in signing up, you can sign up now for free by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code on screen. The yuan had become the most traded foreign currency on the Moscow Stock Exchange, MOEX, after the Western sanctions, as everybody else had refused to trade with Russia. The deficit in liquidity of the yuan has come because China's refused to be paid in rubles and will only receive the yuan as payments. This makes sense as the value of the ruble is volatile in the global market. Unfortunately, as the ruble continues to plunge, Russian banks are faced with a big problem. Reports from September show that the ruble fell by almost 5% against the yuan. More data from MOEX predicts that the central bank's daily yuan sales will rise to $200 million. As the situation gets out of hand, banks like Sberbank are now calling on the central bank to take action. The bank's CEO, Kerch, said, "We cannot lend the yuan because we have nothing to cover our foreign currency positions with." Due to these foreign currency shortages, Russian businesses have been forced to depend on yuan swap deals provided by the Bank of Russia, but this happens at ridiculously high rates. Swap deals are financial agreements between parties that are meant to help manage risk. In these deals, one party, in this case Russian businesses, pay a premium to the other party, which compensates them for the risk of the financial transaction. In the first months of 2024, swap deals were being done at about 2.4 billion yuan on average. In June, when the US increased its threats about secondary sanctions, there was a frightening jump to 10.3 billion yuan, with the figure coming down a little in July to 6.5 billion. August has reported the worst numbers, with the figure jumping to 20 billion. If this continues, Russia will not have enough currency to be able to make any of their payments. The situation's only going to get worse as Russian businesses report that there have been growing delays in payments with Chinese trading partners, with billions of yuan being withheld for months on end. This is because Chinese state banks are closing transactions with Russia in mass numbers and withholding payments to them. Financial institutions in China that were previously making payments to and for Russia have been scrutinizing the transactions heavily, and now payments that are flagged are being held back in Chinese state banks. This means that Russian businesses that make their money through oil and gas exports are suffering the most. The situation intensified in August when Chinese state banks carried out a mass shutdown of Russian transactions worth billions of yuan. A source in Russian business reported on the situation, stating, "At that moment, all cross-border payments to China stopped. We found solutions, but it took about 3 weeks, which is a very long time. Trade volumes fell drastically during that time." Russian businesses have had to turn to other countries for help, but this has been extremely expensive. The other alternative has been trying to use smaller Chinese banks for trading under different company names. One source stated that they were buying gold and moving it to Hong Kong to sell it there through middlemen. These side-door transactions mean that Russian businesses have to use chains of intermediaries in third countries to handle their transactions and run them through Chinese banks. This method also comes at a cost, and transactions have risen to 6%. Some of you may be wondering why China's doing this to its biggest ally. In the world of geopolitics, China and Russia have had each other's back. In 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and the West brought heavy sanctions against it, China became its biggest economic partner. China's been Russia's largest trading partner, making up a third of Russia's foreign trade in 2023. Bilateral trade between Russia and China grew by 1.6% to $137 billion in the first half of 2024, after hitting a record high of $240 billion in 2023. The countries supplied Russia with vital industrial equipment and consumer goods throughout the war, and this has kept Russia afloat. When everyone turned their back on Russia again in 2022, China was right there beside it to help it weather the storm of Western sanctions. Unfortunately, conditions are changing, and the time has come for China to start thinking about itself as well. The US has warned them that if they're found to be dealing with Russian businesses who are on the sanctions list, they'll be hit with the same sanctions. These sanctions are known as secondary sanctions, and they'll be placed on China for indirectly helping the war effort. By allowing money to be paid to Russian companies, the West believes that China is working as a facilitator, which frustrates the aim of the Western sanctions. Chinese businesses have to think about themselves as well, and protecting their personal interests means taking these threats made by Washington seriously. Large companies in China rely on the American and European markets for trade, and if they want to keep afloat, they need to forget about their friendship with Russia. There are currently 265 Chinese companies on the US stock exchange, with a total market of $848 billion. This means that China has a lot to lose if it keeps helping Russia out. Dmitry Berachevsky, head of the economic department at Russia's foreign ministry, commented on this at a conference in Moscow in August, saying, "And they're being told, guys, if you continue to work with Russia, we'll cut off your access to our market and choke off your oxygen supply." As Chinese banks have tightened compliance, Russia's imports from China have fallen more than 1% to $62 billion in the first half of 2024. Russia's central bank forecasts that the country's total imports globally will fall as far as 3% this year. The central bank blames the decrease in imports on the strengthening of the sanctions barriers related to payments and logistics. In the beginning, the Kremlin underplayed the damage that the sanctions were causing, but now we're watching as an economic crisis unfolds in Russia. In a speech to Russia's parliament, Putin boastfully stated that the Russian economy and system of government have turned out to be much stronger than the West believed. In the year after he made these comments, the Russian government's revenue plunged by 35%, while expenditures jumped 59%. This led to a budget deficit of about $23.3 billion. Western countries have imposed sanctions in Russia as a way of starving the funds Russia was using to fuel its invasion of Ukraine. Since February 2022, Western countries have announced more than 11,300 sanctions and have frozen some $300 billion of Russia's foreign reserves. In recent months, the UK has also imposed new bans on Russian metal, diamond, and energy exports. The EU has also announced the sanctions of 200 organizations and people that it's identified helping Russians acquire weapons. These sanctions also include companies that have participated in shipping North Korean weapons to Russia. Sanctions have also dealt deadly blows to Russia's import market, as there's been a ban on exports of technology that Russia might need for military use. The West has taken these sanctions very seriously and banned imports of gold and diamond. Certain airlines have even stopped flights from Russia in a bid to isolate the country. Russian oligarchs have also been sanctioned with their overseas assets being frozen and some of their yachts being impounded as well. As if this isn't enough, multinational companies like McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Starbucks, and Heineken have also stopped selling and making goods in Russia and sold all their locations in Russia back to the government. Clothing companies like H&M, Zara, and Diesel have paused all their sales in Russia, as most international brands have chosen to side with the West. Although the Kremlin claims that it's not been affected by these changes, US Treasury claims sanctions have cut 5% from the economic growth that Russia would have experienced in the past 2 years. The sanctions have different sectors with different levels of severity. We'll start with oil production, which is a big part of Russia's economy. Before sanctions, Russia was the world's third largest oil producer, with a 12% oil market. Russia's 3 biggest export destinations used to be Europe, China, and Turkey. Things changed at the end of 2022 when a majority of Russian crude oil exports to Europe were banned. For countries like China and India who are still choosing to do business with Russia, the new price cap has been placed at $60 a barrel, which is below the global benchmark of $82. Currently, a barrel of Urals crude oil, Russia's main blend of oil, has fallen to an estimated $49.50 per barrel, which is way below the price cap set. This is because customers like China and India have taken advantage of the sanctions and negotiated for lower prices. Next, we turn to Russia's automotive industry, which has been severely affected by the sanctions. Volkswagen, Renault, Ford, and Nissan have all halted production in Russia and sold their assets to the government and Chinese firms. According to the Association of European Businesses, the sales of new cars in Russia have dropped by 63%. As a case study, we can take a look at Russian carmaker AvtoVAZ that has been placed on the U.S. Specially Designated Nationals and Blocked Persons List, or SDN list. The sanctions on the business have been detrimental for its export of Russian vehicles to the global market. In a bid to save the business, AvtoVAZ decided to relaunch production by partnering with Chinese companies to manufacture vehicles. Unfortunately, these partnerships are probably going to break down soon because of the secondary sanctions that will be imposed on Chinese companies that trade with sanctioned businesses. This means that Russian car-making businesses like AvtoVAZ are going to be out of business soon. All of the issues with importing and exporting brand new vehicles has meant that the second-hand car market's booming. Autostat CEO Sergei Udalov told Reuters, budget Ladas and Chinese cars with prices of 2 million rubles and more remain in it, while premium brands have almost completely left. What's even sadder is that Russia can't even turn to its closest ally, China, during this automotive crisis. The payment issues between Russia and China caused by the US sanctions mean that Russian importers of Chinese cars have been losing out on big business. China's also not been sitting back while all of this misfortune's been happening. They've taken over Russia's car market and begun to sell since companies like Nissan and Renault have pulled out. This may be beneficial for China, but with no car production happening in Russia, Moscow's getting the short end of the deal. Another market that's experiencing major losses is the mineral market. Sanctions have been placed on the export of precious metals such as diamonds, gold, and steel. Companies like Nornickel, which is the world's largest producer of refined nickel and palladium, stated that the sanctions have been affecting their ability to push their metals. The numerous difficulties with cross-border payments have meant profits have been lower than ever before. The US has placed sanctions on the company's copper units and other affiliates that provide services to Russian miners. The technology industry in Russia has also been affected by the sanctions. The restrictions imposed on exports of high-technology goods have increased as the West tries to weaken Russian production capacity. Russian citizens are also no longer able to enjoy their favorite technology products as the imports of many famous gadgets have fallen too. Non-sanctioning countries have tried to come to Russia's rescue, but there's no substitute for well-known and established brands like Apple and Samsung, as these two companies have halted their shipments to Russia. China and Turkey's technology imports into Russia have exceeded pre-war level, and Kazakhstan has also stepped in. But their imports are not enough to meet the gaping hole that's been left. The United States has also gone as far as to hit Russia with sanctions on software and information technology services. This ban limits the provision of IT services and support to any person in the Russian Federation, but also applies to countries that trade with Russia. The goal of these restrictions is to limit the ability that Russian military-industrial bases have to take advantage of certain US software and services. By placing these restrictions, the US has disrupted the Russian military-industrial base's reliance on foreign IT systems. This is a decisive blow because most of Russia's major software companies are based in the US. This ban will also impact Russia's access to software such as business intelligence or computer-aided design. Under the circumstances, Russia's ability to keep its economy afloat till now is very impressive. Russia managed to pivot from being the largest exporter of commodities in Europe to selling to China and India in a short space of time. The change was costly, but it managed to leverage what it had to keep things going. The thing about sanctions is it takes some time for them to kick in, but once they do, their impact is undeniable. In every sector of the Russian economy, we can see the damage that the sanctions from the West have done. As more money's pumped into the war effort, the coffers are drying out. Russian banks are feeling the heat the most currently, and we'll just have to wait and see how this all plays out.
Getting reports that a large number of Hezbollah members have been injured across Lebanon after their personal wireless devices exploded.
Injuries to their arms, to their legs, even to their faces. Those who were carrying these pagers, they exploded. So Israel was able to compromise Hezbollah's communications network. They are calling on doctors and nurses to head to hospitals to help with this mass casualty event.
Today, Israel launched one of the most unique attacks ever against Hezbollah. Hundreds of Hezbollah operatives had their pagers explode at the same time, which resulted in hundreds of injuries based on early reports. Here are two incidents that were actually caught on camera in Lebanon. This happened so quickly and at such a scale that hospitals overflowed with wounded Hezbollah fighters within hours, and the government had to put out an emergency call for blood donations from the public. Early reports show that Iran's ambassador to Lebanon, Mustafa Amani, was injured in the explosion too. So why is Israel attacking Hezbollah in Lebanon? Well, the history between them is long. But recently, on the 8th of October, the Lebanese armed group Hezbollah fired a barrage of rockets into Israel. The militant group launched guided rockets and artillery shells at Israeli-occupied positions in Shebaa Farms, causing damage and sparking the prospect of war on two fronts for Israel. The attack followed a praising of Hamas by Hezbollah, as the group promoted Hamas's killings and attacks. As you might expect, Israel has been retaliating with drone strikes and artillery fire on Hezbollah positions near the Golan Heights Lebanon border. Hezbollah has not taken this lying down, as they have fired missiles across the border into Israel in a show of what the group calls solidarity with Hamas. This has been ongoing in waves, threatening to further expand and escalate an already unbearable conflict. One can only wonder what this will ultimately lead to. So who or what is Hezbollah? Why is it attacking Israel, and does this mean that Israel is outnumbered now? Also, why is Lebanon finding itself at odds with Israel? I'm going to answer these and more questions in today's video as we explore more on the violence that is reigning in the Middle East that has now brought Lebanon into play. First and foremost, please be sure to hit the like on this video as it helps us out with the algorithm, and let's start. We'll start with the obvious, Hezbollah. Hezbollah, meaning Party of God, is an Iran-backed Shia Muslim militant and political group based here in Lebanon. The group was formed in 1982 during Lebanon's 15-year civil war in response to Israeli forces invading southern Lebanon to expel Palestinian militants attacking Israel. I'll dive more into that incident later on in the video. You see, Iran formed the group with the objective to play a role in the Arab-Israeli conflict in support of Palestinians and to become a prominent regional actor. Now, the militant group has risen from a shadowy faction to a heavily armed force with major sway over the Lebanese state. The U.S. designates Hezbollah as a terrorist group associated with numerous attacks on civilians around the world, including bombings at U.S. and French military barracks in Beirut in 1983 that killed around 300 people. The European Union classifies Hezbollah's military wing as a terrorist group, but not its political arm. Yes, there is a political arm, a military arm, and other arms. Much like Hamas, it too operates with different wings, each assigned to a different set of tasks. It holds a great deal of power in Lebanon in the form of its Shiite political party, which holds 62 seats in the country's parliament alongside its Iran-backed proxy militant unit. For those of you who might be wondering why another militant group is worth the talk and effort after so much destruction has already occurred, let me stop you right there. Hezbollah is not just some small, disorganized group. Hezbollah is what Hamas really wants to be like when it grows up. As bad as their terrorist actions have been, Hamas is weak when compared to the likes of Hezbollah. The militant group is a much more formidable fighting force and is widely recognized as the most powerful non-state military in the world. Its military wing has grown to overtake Lebanon's army as the main military force in the country, and it is powerful enough to defeat most Arab armies, making it the most powerful non-state actor in the region. The group is well funded too, with the U.S. State Department saying that Iran provides most of Hezbollah's training, weapons, and funding, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars a year. To no one's surprise, Despite Israel's attacks on Lebanon that have resulted in a few deaths, Hezbollah's deputy chief Naim Qassem has reiterated that his party was fully ready to contribute to the fighting. His exact words at a rally were, "The behind-the-scenes calls with us by great powers, Arab countries, envoys of the United Nations, directly and indirectly telling us not to interfere, will have no effect." What he's saying is the militant group will not be swayed into non-involvement. So now that we know what the militant group attacking Israel is, let's step out of the frame so that we see Lebanon and how exactly it is involved in this. In order to understand Lebanon-Israeli relations, we need to go back to the very start of the matter, back to the very creation of Israel in the last century. It all started with the big question surrounding Palestine and its land. You see, back in the day, the Ottoman Empire controlled that part of the Middle East from the early 16th century. It was only after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire during World War I that Britain gained control of Palestine, which was inhabited by a Jewish minority and an Arab majority. At the time, both Israelis and Palestinians were struggling for self-determination and sovereignty over the territory, developing respective movements for their causes. In the years leading up to the end of the First World War, the great powers were already carving out land for distribution. In fact, in 1916, the Sykes-Picot Agreement that was secretly negotiated between Britain and France planned to carve up the Middle East into spheres of influence and determined that the land in question was to be internationalized. The following year, in 1917, Britain's Foreign Secretary, Lord Arthur Balfour, expressed his government's support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people in a letter to Baron Walter Rothschild, the head of the British wing of the influential European Jewish banking family. We will talk about the Rothschild family in another video. You would not believe the power this family wields. Nevertheless, this letter by Lord Arthur Balfour is where the conflict begins. To the Israelis, this official letter marks a formal utterance of the Israeli state's right to exist. But to Palestinians, it was an early sign of their dispossession. The letter marked the beginning of a slicing up of their ancestral land. The declaration in the letter also noted that it was clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, nodding to the overwhelming majority Arab population in the region at the time, who were about 80% of the population. As the years progressed and the Jews began to be persecuted, with particular emphasis on the horrible Nazi persecutions and the Holocaust, more and more Jewish people migrated to Palestine seeking a home. Throughout all this, both sides continued to assert their right to establish a state. This led to heavy friction between Jews and Arabs, as well as resistance to British rule. In 1947, the United Nations voted to divide Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under international administration. That is the key part of all of this. The land was to be divided into two states, one Arab and one Jewish. Naturally, the Jewish leadership embraced the plan, but the Arab side rejected it, arguing that it was unfavorable to their majority population, and it was never implemented. The following year, unable to end the strife, British authorities withdrew and Jewish leaders immediately proclaimed the founding of Israel as a state. Many Palestinians naturally objected, and a war ensued as creating a Jewish state meant a dividing of the territory, and also since no separate state for Arab Palestinians was established. Enter Lebanon. I want you to take a look at where Lebanon is relative to Israel and the whole region at large so you can understand a lot of what I'll be mentioning. Despite having the smallest army in the region by far, Lebanon responded to the call of war by Arab leaders in the region. The moment Israel declared its independence on the 14th of May 1948, the Arab coalition was ready. The very next day, the 7-member Arab League, including Lebanon, publicly proclaimed their aim of creating a democratic United States of Palestine in place of the United Nations partition plan for Palestine. The League then waged war on the side of the Palestinian Arabs, thus beginning the international phase of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. If you're a student of history or have been watching the past videos posted to the channel, you know what came next. Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Transjordan, and Iraq were all soundly defeated and repelled by the Israeli forces, which occupied South Lebanon. This resulted in Israel signing armistice agreements with each of its invading neighbors. The armistice with Lebanon was signed on the 23rd of March, 1949 specifically. As part of the agreement with Lebanon, Israeli forces withdrew to the international border. By the conclusion of that war, Israel had signed ceasefire agreements with all of the neighboring Arab countries. The territory it now controlled went well beyond what had been allocated to it under the United Nations Partition Plan, incorporating much of what had been promised to the Palestinian Arabs under the plan. However, it was understood by all the state parties at the time that the armistice agreements were not peace treaties with Israel, nor the final resolution of the conflict between them, including the borders. It was merely the aftermath of war where the defeated had little to no say. This is where it begins to get interesting. Because much of the land was now owned by Israel, there was a mass immigration of Palestinians who had been living in those areas previously. Some say they fled, some say they immigrated, and some say they were forced out. I suppose each side has its own version. The point is that about 700,000 Palestinians fled, seeking new areas and new homes as they entered neighboring countries. By 1949, there were around 110,000 Palestinian Arabs in Lebanon living in camps established by and administered by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. The movement of this many Palestinians into the country created some problems of its own. You see, the vast majority of the refugees were Muslim, and at the time Lebanon was a Christian country. The Lebanese Christians feared that the Muslim influx would affect their political dominance and their assumed demographic majority. Accordingly, they imposed restrictions on the status of the Palestinian refugees. These restrictions included stipulations that the refugees could not work, travel, or engage in political activities. At first, the effects of these weren't really seen because, well, for starters, these refugees had just fled home and were living in camps. Secondly, the refugees were too impoverished to develop a leadership capable of representing their concerns. As time went on, the Palestine Liberation Organization, still at war with Israel, started recruiting militants in Lebanon from among the families of Palestinian refugees who had left Israel in 1948. Keep this point in mind, I'll come back to it soon. When war again reared its head in the 1967 Six-Day War, Lebanon rejected calls by other Arab governments to participate. The simple reason for this was Lebanon was far too weak to risk conflict with Israel. However, although Lebanon played no role in that war, it was not spared the implications that followed by the Arab states. Immediately after the war, because of the weakness of its central government and its proximity to Israel, Lebanon was identified by the Arab world as an ideal base for Palestinian terror. Again, I direct you back to the map. See how geographically well-positioned Lebanon is, especially if you are someone planning an attack on Israel, which, well, the Arab states were. From 1968 onwards, the Palestine Liberation Organization began conducting raids from Lebanon into Israel, and Israel began making retaliatory raids against Lebanese villages to encourage the Lebanese people to deal with the problem. However, tensions kept heightening. After an Israeli airline was machine-gunned at Athens airport, Israel raided the Beirut International Airport in retaliation, destroying 13 civilian aircraft. This added animosity towards Israel from the Lebanese. This was the problem that Lebanon had. The unarmed citizenry could not expel the armed foreigners, while the Lebanese army was too weak militarily and politically. This meant they were now both at the mercy of Israeli retaliation and the Arab forces gathering within their country. The Cairo Agreement of November 1969 gave the PLO special status in Lebanon, and after their defeat in Jordan in September 1970, Yasser Arafat, then chairman of the PLO, the entire Fatah leadership, and its fighting force moved into southern Lebanon. This is when Lebanon officially became a training ground for terrorists from all over the world. The PLO was able to recruit sympathizers from other terrorist organizations and from the hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees in camps across the country. During the 1970s, PLO terrorists carried out hundreds of cross-border attacks on Israel from Lebanon. One of the worst was the Ma'alat massacre, in which 26 people, including 21 students, were held hostage and killed in a school in the northern Israeli town of Ma'alat. Israel, on top of regular attacks, would also make it a point to retaliate against its enemies on Lebanon's land. A good example of this is how, in reaction to the 1972 Munich massacre, Israel carried out Operation Spring of Youth. Members of Israel's elite special forces landed by boat in Lebanon on the 9th of April 1973. And with the aid of Israeli intelligence agents, infiltrated the PLO headquarters in Beirut and assassinated several members of its leadership. Within Lebanon itself, trouble was brewing. Do you remember the Christian majority I spoke of earlier? Well, about that. You see, the influx of Palestinian fighters into Lebanon upset the delicate balance between Muslims and Christians in the country, and in 1975 led to civil war. Lebanese Christians seeking to restore the ethnic balance and free the country from growing PLO control looked to Israel for support. The two sides had a common interest: to drive the terrorists from their Lebanese base. Two Christian enclaves supported by Israel were set up in the south. That led to the establishment of the Israeli-backed South Lebanon Army under Major Saad Haddad. Beginning in May 1976, Israel supplied the Maronite militias, including the Lebanese forces led by Bakir Gamayal, with arms, tanks, and military advisors. The border between Israel and Lebanon was at the time nicknamed the Good Fence because of the alliance between the nations. Fearing loss of commercial access to the port of Beirut, in June 1976, Syria intervened in the civil war to support the Maronite-dominated government, and by October had 40,000 troops stationed within Lebanon. However, this was short-lived, as Syria soon switched sides. Much like Israel, the Syrians had used the civil war to gain a foothold in Lebanon. They had intervened in 1976, first on the side of the Christians, then on the side of the PLO. With close Syrian support, the PLO grew bolder and started to attack Israel, launching raids and the like. In July 1981, they launched a huge artillery barrage on northern Israel. Full-on war was narrowly averted through last-minute American mediation. The peace, however, was short-lived, as it only lasted a year. After that, Israel launched Peace for Galilee, an operation designed to drive the PLO and the Syrians from Lebanon, and pave the way for a peace treaty with the Lebanese Christian leadership under the charismatic Bashir Gamayal. In June 1982, Israeli ground forces quickly overran PLO positions in southern Lebanon. The Israeli army laid siege to Beirut, and during the conflict, according to Lebanese sources, between 15,000 and 20,000 people were killed, mostly civilians. On August 30th, Arafat and the rest of the PLO leaders were forced to leave Lebanon after intense Israeli shelling of Beirut. Gamayal, elected president in July, spoke of peace with Israel, telling Israeli leaders that he would come to Jerusalem as a second Sadat. 2 months later, he was assassinated, presumably by the Syrians, who wanted to preempt the burgeoning Israeli-Lebanese alliance, which they saw as a strategic threat. The next day, Christian militiamen moved into the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila and butchered more than 300 unarmed civilians. Israel, which had allowed the militiamen into the camps to seek out Palestinian gunmen, was blamed for the massacre. Throughout the war, the world media had been highly critical of Israel and of its defense minister, Ariel Sharon, who was eventually forced to resign after an Israeli commission found him indirectly responsible for the killings. Still, Israel and the new Lebanese authorities were able to negotiate a peace deal in the spring of 1983. But a year later, under intense Syrian pressure, Lebanese President Amin Gamayal, Bashir's older brother, renounced the agreement. This was the moment that Hezbollah entered the scene. Shiite Muslims, influenced by the 1979 Khomeini revolution in Iran, formed the Hezbollah militia to oppose Israel. Israel remained in occupation of a security zone in the south to protect its northern border. That led to an 18-year-long war of attrition with Hezbollah, in which hundreds of Israelis died. In February 1992, Israel assassinated the Hezbollah chief, Sheikh Abbas Musawi, who was succeeded by the present leader, Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah. Two major Israeli air operations, Accountability in 1993 and Grapes of Wrath in 1996, followed persistent Katyusha. These were rocket attacks on northern Israel, but had little long-term effect. In May 2000, Israel withdrew from Lebanon to the international border in a move ratified by the United Nations. This resulted in the creation of what they call the Blue Line. Essentially, the Blue Line is a demarcation line between Lebanon and Israel, and Lebanon and the Golan Heights, published by the United Nations on the 7th of June 2000 for the purposes of determining whether Israel had fully withdrawn from Lebanon. It has been described as temporary and not a border, but a line of withdrawal. On the other hand, Hezbollah moved militiamen down to the border, and like the PLO before them, created a state within a state in the south. In September 2004, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1559, which called for the removal of Syrian forces from Lebanon and the dismantlement of all militias, including Hezbollah. The Syrians and Hezbollah ignored it, but the Syrians eventually had to pull out of Lebanon following some very uncalled for actions. You would think peace would have reigned at last, but no. In the 6 years following Israel's withdrawal, Hezbollah, with Syrian and Iranian support, had built up an estimated force of 12,000 to 14,000 Katyusha rockets capable of hitting a wide range of Israeli cities, towns, and villages. Under the Katyusha umbrella, Hezbollah militiamen felt that they could carry out cross-border attacks with relative impunity, confident that Israel would refrain from sharp retaliation for fear of triggering a massive bombardment of its civilian population. Moreover, both the Iranians and Syrians could use the Hezbollah threat to pressure Israel or intimidate their critics in the international community. By mid-2006, the situation had become strategically unacceptable to Israel. Tensions were high, and all that was needed was one more spark. And that spark came in July 2006. As you can expect, that's when things went boom. On July 12th, Hezbollah initiated diversionary rocket attacks on Israeli military positions near the coast and near the Israeli border village of Zarit. As this happened, another Hezbollah group crossed from Lebanon into Israel and ambushed 2 Israeli army vehicles, killing 3 Israeli soldiers and seizing 2. Hezbollah promptly demanded the release of Lebanese prisoners held by Israel, including Samir Kuntar, and an alleged surviving perpetrator of the Coastal Road massacre, in exchange for the release of the captured soldiers. Heavy fire between the sides was exchanged across the length of the Blue Line, with Hezbollah targeting IDF positions near Israeli towns. Throughout the conflict, the Israeli government responded with airstrikes, targeting Hezbollah positions inside Lebanon, followed later by a ground offensive designed to remove Hezbollah terrorists from southern Lebanon. Hezbollah retaliated by firing Katyusha rockets at Israeli towns and cities in the north of Israel at a rate of more than 100 rockets per day for the duration of the conflict. The conflict was messy. In Lebanon, the conflict killed over 1,100 people, including combatants, destroyed massive infrastructure, and displaced about 1 million people. Israel, on the other hand, suffered 42 civilian deaths as a result of prolonged rocket attacks being launched into northern Israel, causing the displacement of 500,000 Israelis. Normal life across much of Lebanon and northern Israel was disrupted, in addition to the deaths in combat. On August 12, 2006, the war ended with a United Nations brokered ceasefire in which the Lebanese agreed to take control of southern Lebanon from Hezbollah with the help of the United Nations. Over the years since then, Israel and Hezbollah have had several skirmishes, and several deaths have resulted from this. Israel accuses Hezbollah of several violations, and the reverse happens as well. However, there has not been any war as direct or as violent as the 2006 one, as both Hezbollah and Israel try to keep to their side of the blue border as hard as that may be. But things have changed now, or at least they seem to have. With Hezbollah openly supporting Hamas, what could happen if they choose to also attack Israel in support of their ally? Well, the truth is that this war would then turn into something much larger and much more dangerous. It is possible that not just the whole region, but the whole world will be dragged into that conflict, igniting a global war. That is an outcome no one desires. To allow you to sigh, most analysts don't think that Hezbollah wants to provoke an all-out war with Israel. That's because of the basis of Israel's arsenal and allies. If these minor attacks escalated to total war, Hezbollah stands no chance and would be obliterated. I suppose, as with all things, time will tell. It's quite hard to make such judgment calls when Hezbollah sends messages to Hamas saying, and I quote, "Our hearts are with you, our minds are with you, our souls are with you, our history and guns and our rockets are with you." At this point, let's just see how the border conflicts pan out, as this conflict drags on day by day. What I do know for a fact, however, is that the Business Basics community prays for peace and tranquility in the region. If you want to get the most important geopolitical news today without the technical glitches, you should sign up for Global Recaps. Global Recaps is an email newsletter that shows up straight in your inbox, covering the world's most important news, and there's no third-party censorship on these topics. This is a short and simple email that takes about 5 minutes to read, with all the most important topics covered. On top of that, not only is it unbiased, uncensored, and completely free, but you can sign up right now by going to globalrecaps.com or using the link in the description and become more knowledgeable about the world you live in.